The others called after him immediately. Their voices rose from confused to urgent within seconds, climbing toward desperation. But Travis was already walking, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor, his eyes fixed on the underside craft above him. He would say later that he heard every word, every plea, every escalating command come back, but that his legs simply carried him forward as though the decision to approach had been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The craft fascinated him in a way that overrode every other instinct. He had faced bears. He had climbed onto the backs of bulls. He was not the kind of man who stopped walking toward things that frightened him. He got to within perhaps 60 feet of the object, close enough to see the individual panels of light in detail, close enough to feel something, a low vibration that was less a sound than a sensation, traveling up to the ground and into the soles of his boots and settling somewhere behind his sternum. He stopped. He tilted his head back and stared upward. The crew's voices had become frantic. They were screaming his name. One of the men later described breaking into sobs at that moment, gripping the dashboard of the truck with both hands, absolutely convinced that something terrible was about to happen, and equally convinced that there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Travis heard them. He was about to turn around. He had made the decision, had shifted his weight to begin the turn, and then the craft moved. It was subtle at first, a slight rotation, a barely perceptible wobble, as though something internal had shifted and set the entire disk into a new state of readiness. With the movement came sound, a low, resonant mechanical hum that grew quickly into something overwhelming, a noise that seemed to fill not just the air but the cavity of the chest, the space behind the eyes. The light panels blazed brighter. The hum became a roar. Travis turned to run. He never made it more than a step. A bolt of blue-white energy erupted from the underside of the craft and struck him squarely in the torso. The force of it lifted him completely off his feet and hurled him backward through the air, a full 20 feet, before he crashed to the ground and lay still. The beam lasted less than a second. The entire sequence happened so fast that the crew members watching from inside the truck would later struggle to agree on precise order of events, though they agreed completely on the essential horror of the moment. Travis Walton had been shot by something from the craft above him, lifted off the earth like a rag doll, and now he was not moving. Mike Rogers floored the accelerator. The truck lurched fishtailed and fled back down the access road. Nobody spoke. Two of the men were openly weeping. Mike's hands were locked so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles had gone white. They drove for perhaps a mile before he hit the brakes, pulled to the shoulder, and sat in the darkness with the engine idling and his crew coming apart around him. He stared through the windshield at the empty road ahead. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We have to go back for him." Nobody argued. Going back was terrifying. But leaving Travis behind was something none of them could live with. Not even for the time it would take to find help. They turned around. They drove back up to the clearing. The craft was gone. The sky above the pines was empty and black and absolutely, profoundly silent. Travis was gone, too. Mike got out of the truck. He stood at the edge of the clearing and called Travis's name into the dark. His voice broke on the second syllable. He dropped to his knees in the dirt and cried with the particular, helpless anguish of a man who has failed someone who trusted him. The 6 remaining crew members drove to the nearest payphone, and Ken Peterson, quiet, steady, newly married, the most composed of the group by the thinnest of margins, called the Navajo County Sheriff's Department. He told them a crew member was missing. He told them where. He said it would be difficult to explain over the phone. When Sheriff Marlin Gillespie and his partner arrived, they found 6 men in various states of emotional collapse. Some were still crying. Some stared at nothing with the hollow, glassy look of people who had witnessed something their minds were still refusing to fully process. Mike Rogers looked as though he had aged a decade in the past 2 hours. Sheriff Gillespie, a pragmatic man shaped by decades of law enforcement in rural Arizona, conducted field sobriety checks on all of them. Every one of them was sober. Whatever state they were in had not been chemically induced. Something had happened to these men tonight. Gillespie could see that plainly. He simply had no intention of taking seriously the explanation they were offering. His working theory was immediate and firm. These men had done something to Travis Walton, and the UFO story was a cover-up, a clumsy, poorly coordinated cover-up, riddled with emotional excess, but a cover-up nonetheless. He ordered a search of the area at first light. The search was extensive. Dozens of volunteers moved through the forest in organized grids. Dogs were brought in. Scent trails were followed until they ended without explanation. The clearing where the crew had seen the craft showed no obvious physical evidence. No scorching on the soil, no impression in the earth, no debris of any kind. Travis Walton had vanished from a patch of Arizona wilderness, and the forest had kept his secret perfectly. During the search, Mike Rogers noticed something unusual. 3 men in red jackets moving through the area, operating instruments that resembled Geiger counters or radiation detectors. He felt a surge of cautious hope. Maybe the sheriff's department had been more open-minded than he'd assumed. Maybe someone had thought to bring in investigators with the right kind of equipment. He approached them and asked if they would scan the crew's hard hats, which had remained in the truck bed during the entire encounter and had been within range of whatever energy the craft had emitted. One of the men in red held his instrument close to a helmet. The needle swung hard, all the way to the maximum reading. The man looked at Mike, then at the helmet. He turned to his colleagues without a word and gestured for them to stop what they were doing. The 3 of them turned together and walked away from the search site, out of the clearing, around a bend in the access road. They did not look back. They did not explain themselves. Mike reported this to Sheriff Gillespie immediately. Gillespie was baffled. He had not ordered any radiation testing. He had no record of any such personnel being deployed to the site. A search of the surrounding area found no trace of the 3 men. No one among the dozens of volunteers and law enforcement officers could say where they had come from or where they had gone. They had appeared, found something, and silently vanished, taking their findings with them. No one ever identified them. No report was ever filed. Days accumulated. The town of Snowflake, deprived of answers, turned against the crew. Rumors solidified into conviction. The 6 men had killed Travis Walton and invented an alien abduction as a desperate alibi. The sheriff's department made little effort to discourage this narrative, openly suggesting to reporters that the UFO claim was a hoax. National and international media descended on the small Arizona town in a wave, transforming it into a circus of satellite trucks and camera crews and people shouting questions through car windows. The crew members stopped being seen as witnesses and started being treated as suspects. Their faces appeared on the covers of newspapers under headlines that implied guilt without stating it outright. Their families were approached. Their neighbors were interviewed. The pressure was constant and suffocating. Facing a mounting crisis with no resolution in sight, Sheriff Gillespie made a decision. He brought in one of the country's most respected polygraph examiners, a specialist who confirmed accuracy rate between 92 and 98%, and had all 6 crew members examined individually over the course of a single full day. The examinations focused on the central question. Had these men harmed Travis Walton? 5 of the 6 passed without equivocation. The 6th test was ruled inconclusive due to a procedural problem with the administration of that particular examination, not because deception was detected. The examiner, a man who had spent his career separating truth from lies in criminal cases, delivered his verdict to the sheriff with measured precision. It would be effectively impossible for 5 people involved in a murder conspiracy to all defeat a professional polygraph examination conducted at this level. They were telling the truth. He staked his professional reputation on it. Sheriff Gillespie had no response to that. He had no case. He had no body. He had no evidence. He had 6 frightened men who were telling the truth about something he fundamentally could not accept as possible. And 5 days after Travis Walton disappeared, the phone rang. It was Travis's brother who answered. He heard a voice on the other end of the line, thin, cracked, barely holding itself together. Say his name. He thought it was a prank. He thought grief was doing something to his perception. But the voice said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "It's me. They brought me back." And it gave an address. Travis was standing at a payphone, at a rest stop less than a mile from Snowflake. He was pale and severely dehydrated. His clothes were the same ones he had been wearing 5 days earlier, unchanged and undamaged. He had the eyes of a person who had witnessed something so far outside the boundaries of ordinary experience that ordinary expression could not yet reach it, distant, fractured, still processing. When his brother arrived and folded him into an embrace, Travis barely reacted. He stood with his arms loose at his sides and his gaze fixed somewhere past his brother's shoulder, looking at something that wasn't there. He did not know 5 days had passed. In his mind, it had been a matter of hours at most, possibly less. When his brother told him the date, Travis went still in a way that frightened the people around him. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a mind overwhelmed past its capacity to function. He sat in the car, without speaking for a long time. The town they drove through was familiar and entirely strange at the same time, like a place revisited in a dream. A doctor examined him in Phoenix, under conditions of secrecy at the family's request. The findings were unremarkable in most respects: dehydration, significant malnutrition, evidence of prolonged physiological stress consistent with days without adequate food or water. There was, however, one anomaly. On the inside of Travis's left forearm, in the soft crook of the elbow, there was a single puncture wound, fresh, clean, precisely placed, entirely consistent with a hypodermic injection. Travis had no history of intravenous drug use. His full toxicology screening came back completely clear. Whatever had been administered through that needle, if anything, had left no chemical trace that modern medicine could identify. Someone or something had put a needle in his arm. What had been injected and why was never determined. The memories came back slowly and unevenly, the way certain dreams return hours after waking, not all at once, but in pieces, vivid in some details and smeared in others, carrying an emotional weight that seemed far larger than the individual images themselves. Travis gave his first comprehensive account to the National Enquirer, which had offered to relocate him away from a media siege surrounding Snowflake and to fund a thorough medical and psychological evaluation in exchange for his exclusive story. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it gave him something he desperately needed: distance and time. He described waking on a surface that was cold, smooth, and slightly curved beneath him, staring up at a ceiling that glowed with a faint, sourceless orange light. There were figures moving around him, 3 of them small and slight, standing no more than 4 feet tall, with large rounded skulls and eyes that were dark, deep-set, and wide, eyes that held no expression he could read, that reflected the light without absorbing it. They wore white garments that appeared clinical and functional. They moved around the examination table where he lay with quiet efficiency, handling instruments he didn't recognize, including a flat rectangular object resting on his chest that pulsed with a rhythm he could feel but not hear. His first instinct, even through his disorientation, had been relief. He assumed he was in a hospital. The figures around him must be medical personnel. Unusual looking, yes, their proportions not quite right, but medical personnel nonetheless. He had been hurt by whatever came out of that craft, and his crew had gotten him the help. That was what he told himself. That was what he held on to. It wasn't until one of the figures leaned in close enough for Travis to see its face in full, unmediated detail, that the relief disintegrated entirely. The face was gray and finely textured, with no visible nose to speak of, a tiny slit of mouth, and those enormous dark eyes positioned too wide on a skull that tapered sharply at the jaw. It regarded him with an expression he could not name because it appeared to contain nothing he recognized as emotion. It was simply looking at him, cataloging him, the way a researcher looks at a specimen, with interest and without warmth. Travis screamed. He scrambled backward off the examination table with a force born of pure animal terror, scattering instruments, ripping away whatever had been attached to his body. He found a metal rod near the base of the table and snatched it up, backing himself into the corner of the small room and swinging the rod in front of him like a man trying to keep wolves at bay. The 3 figures turned to face him. They did not startle. They did not recoil. They watched him with that same calm, systematic interest, tracking his movements, observing his panic. And then, as though arriving at some wordless agreement, they turned as one and walked out of the room. Travis stood alone, his chest heaving, the rod still raised. He gave himself 30 seconds to be afraid. Then he moved. He crept down the corridor outside the door and turned in the direction opposite to where the figures had gone. The hallway was smooth and featureless, with walls that seemed to generate their own pale light rather than reflecting it from any visible source. He found a small, circular room containing nothing but a single chair, a chair that appeared to have some kind of interface built into its armrests. He pressed every surface of it, hoping for anything. A panel to open, a door to release, an alarm to trigger. Nothing happened. The room was sealed. He was trapped, and then a figure appeared in the doorway. This one was different, and the difference struck her with the force of something almost miraculous. It looked human. It was dressed in a close-fitting helmet and a smooth, form-fitting suit, the kind of garment he associated with astronauts or test pilots. It was nearly his own height. The face behind the visor was recognizably, undeniably human in its general proportions. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, set in a head that was the right shape and right size. Travis lunged toward it. He grabbed the figure's arm and began talking rapidly. Where was he? What was this place? What was happening? How long had he been here? What did they want with him? The questions tumbling out on top of each other in a torrent of desperation. The figure did not respond. Not verbally, not physically, not with any perceptible change in expression. Its eyes, Travis noticed, were open but unfocused in a way that was profoundly unnerving. Not looking at him, exactly, but looking through him, as though his presence had been registered but not truly acknowledged. There was something absent behind those eyes. Something that should have been there was simply not. The figure took Travis gently but firmly by the arm and led him back into the corridor. They walked for what felt like several minutes, moving deeper into the structure, through sections Travis hadn't seen. He passed through a set of heavy doors, and then those doors opened onto something that stopped him cold. A vast hangar, stretching out before him to a distance he couldn't accurately gauge. Inside it, floating silently above the floor with the same impossible, gravity-indifferent ease as the craft he had seen above the forest clearing, were a dozen spacecraft, perhaps more. Each one gleamed under the hangar's even, sourceless illumination. The scale of the space, the sheer engineered enormity of it, communicated something that went beyond technology. It communicated civilization. It communicated a history of travel measured in distances that made the gap between Arizona and the moon seem trivial. Travis was walked across the hangar floor, past the hovering craft, through another door, and into a bright white room where 3 more human-like figures waited beside a second examination table. They moved with the same eerie, automatic precision as his guide. No eye contact, no speech, no acknowledgement of Travis as a thinking or feeling entity rather than an object to be processed and returned. Together, without preamble, they lifted him onto the table. He struggled. He found words he didn't know he had left and said them loudly, demanding answers, demanding to know what they were doing. His strength was nearly exhausted. His resistance amounted to little. They worked around his protests as though they couldn't hear them. A breathing mask was placed over his nose and mouth. He smelled something sweet and clean and slightly sharp, like the air just before a thunderstorm. The last thing Travis Walton saw before the darkness took him was the ceiling of that white room, smooth and seamless and glowing with the same warm orange light he had woken under, receding slowly as he fell backward into nothing. And then he was lying on a wet road in the dark, and rain was falling on his face, and above him, through the clouds, a light was climbing away into the night sky, pulling itself upward with speed that seemed compressed distance, until it was a point, and then less than a point, and then nothing at all. He was alone. He was in Arizona. 5 days had passed, and he had no idea where they had gone. The crew gathered at Mike Rogers' house several weeks after Travis's return. All 7 of them sat together in the same room for what would be one of the last times. Travis sat across from the men who had watched the beam take him, and he told them everything. The examination room, the figures, the hangar full of ships, the human-looking beings who had never spoken and never truly looked at him, the white room and the mask and the darkness and the road. He told it the way a person tells something they have spent weeks trying to convince themselves didn't happen, and finally accepted that it did. The room was very quiet when he finished. These were men who had already spent weeks living with their own version of that night. The blinding flash, the body flung through the air, the empty clearing. They had already paid a significant price for what they'd seen. And now, they were being asked to absorb what had happened on the other side of it. What had been done with the person they had been unable to protect. None of them said they didn't believe him. What they said, quietly and in different ways, was that they wished they didn't have to. In the months and years that followed, the Travis Walton case attracted scrutiny of every conceivable kind. Skeptics proposed that the crew had staged the abduction to escape contract penalties for their logging delay. Investigators noted that this theory required 6 men to successfully deceive one of the country's finest polygraph examiners, repeatedly, over a span of decades, something that same examiner called essentially impossible. Others proposed that Travis had hidden voluntarily in the forest for 5 days, though no one could explain how he had survived the cold without food or water and emerged in the physical condition the doctors observed. Others suggested mass hallucination, shared delusion, or some form of coordinated psychological break. Theories for which no clinical framework exists. Travis wrote a book. It was adapted into a film. He has spoken publicly about the experience hundreds of times over 5 decades, and his account has never significantly varied. More remarkably, neither have the accounts of the 6 crew members, men who scattered to different lives after that night, who had every professional and personal incentive to distance themselves from the story, who gained almost nothing from their continued association with it. Some paid enormously for their refusal to recant. Careers quietly stalled. Friendships became awkward and then distant. One man's family effectively cut ties with him, too embarrassed by the association to maintain it. They were called liars in print, on television, and to their faces. They were called criminals and frauds and attention seekers and lunatics. They held to their story anyway, every single one of them, for 50 years. Ken Peterson, quiet, steady Ken, who had made that first call to sheriff on the night it happened, became perhaps the most affecting witness in the long aftermath. In interviews conducted years and then decades after the case had faded from the headlines, he would sit in front of cameras as an older man, his hair gone gray and his face marked by the passage of time, and he would speak about that night with the same raw, unprocessed immediacy he'd had in 1975. He never seemed to have found distance from it. He never seemed to have located a mental compartment where it could be stored safely, somewhere it couldn't reach him anymore during ordinary moments of ordinary days. In one late interview, he was asked whether the experience still affected his daily life, nearly 4 decades after the fact, with half a lifetime of ordinary living between himself and that clearing in the Sitgreaves. He paused for a long time. His jaw worked. The interviewer waited. "To this day," he said at last, his voice thickening in a way he didn't try to conceal, "I'm afraid to look out my window at night." He stopped, his eyes filled, "because I'm afraid of what I'm going to see out there." He didn't apologize for the tears. He didn't try to qualify the statement or soften it with a laugh. He just sat with it, this man in his 60s, this level-headed, salt-of-the-earth former logger who had built an ordinary life for himself, carrying something from a single night in 1975 that had never stopped being heavy. 16 polygraph examinations, 5 taken by Travis Walton himself at various points across the decades, 11 taken by the remaining crew members. Every single one passed, including the test that was initially ruled inconclusive, which was re-administered properly and passed on retesting. Travis Walton was genuinely missing for 5 days. A full law enforcement search covering the area where he disappeared found no trace of him. He returned in a state consistent with prolonged physiological deprivation, bearing a fresh, unexplained injection site and carrying no drugs in his system whatsoever. 6 independent witnesses, all of whom passed professional lie detection, described watching him struck by a beam of energy from an unidentified craft, lifted off the ground, and thrown 20 feet before the craft vanished with him. There is no theory that accounts for all of these facts simultaneously without requiring something extraordinary. The conspiracy theory demands a level of coordinated deception that professional examiners have repeatedly said the evidence does not support. The psychological theories have no clinical foundation adequate to explain 6 separate individuals generating independently consistent accounts of an identical experience. The criminal theory produced no body, no motive, no forensic evidence, and no inconsistency across 50 years of testimony. What is left, when every comfortable explanation has been held up to the light and found wanting, is the story itself. 7 men drove into a forest on a cold November evening. 6 of them drove out. 5 days later, the 7th came back from somewhere he cannot fully describe, carrying memories of rooms and beings in a vast hangar full of ships that float the way that first craft floated, as though gravity is merely a local custom, easily set aside by things that were built to travel between stars. The truth of what happened in that clearing on November 5th, 1975, remains open. It may always remain open, but the weight of evidence, the testimony, the tests, the 50 years of quiet, costly consistency from men who had everything to gain by simply saying they'd made it all up, presses down on the scales with a force that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. Somewhere in the Sitgreaves National Forest, on a cold November night half a century ago, something happened that we do not have adequate language to describe. 7 ordinary men drove into those trees together. Only 6 of them drove out, and the one who came back 5 days later has spent every year since then trying to find words of where he went, and finding each time that the only explanation that fits every fact is also the one that changes everything. He was taken, and whatever took him brought him back. And none of us, not the investigators, not the scientists, not the skeptics, not the believers, can tell you with certainty why. Over the decades, hundreds of people have come forward with claims of alien abduction. Most of these accounts share a familiar pattern. A lone individual, a remote location, a fragmented memory, and an absence of corroborating evidence. The stories are easy to dismiss, not because they lack passion or conviction, but because they lack witnesses. They exist in the shadows of personal testimony, unsupported by anything the rest of the world can see or touch or verify. And then there is the story of Travis Walton. This is not a story told by one trembling voice in the dark. It is a story confirmed by 6 other men, hard-working, blue-collar loggers who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. It is a story that survived 16 separate polygraph examinations across 4 decades. It is a story that launched a criminal investigation, captivated the international press, and shattered the lives of the people at its center. It remains, to this day, the most credible, most thoroughly examined, and most deeply haunting alien abduction case in recorded history. To understand what happened on the night of November 5th, 1975, you first need to understand the man at the center of it. Travis Walton was 22 years old, and he was a kind of young man who seemed constitutionally incapable of backing down from anything. He grew up in Snowflake, Arizona, a small, tight-knit community tucked into the high desert, where everybody knew everybody and reputations were built slowly and lost quickly. Travis had built it the hard way. He rode a Harley-Davidson that rattled windows as he rolled through town. He competed in bull riding, a sport that required equal measures of insanity and nerve. He boxed, he fought, he laughed loudly and lived loudly, and the people around him loved him for it, even when they shook their heads at him. One story in particular had circulated through Snowflake and taken on the quality of local legend. Travis had been riding in a car with friends when a large black bear burst from the tree line and stood squarely in the middle of the road, massive, wild, and utterly still, blocking their path. The driver hit the brakes. Everyone froze. Everyone, that is, except Travis, who threw open the passenger door, leapt out of the still-slowing vehicle, and sprinted directly at the animal, waving his arms and screaming until the startled bear turned and crashed back into the forest. Travis chased up a hillside before finally stopping, hands on his knees, breathless and grinning. He was that kind of man, not reckless so much as fearless. Genuinely, almost philosophically unafraid of the things that made other people hesitate. It was a quality that served him well in his work, and on most nights, it kept him out of serious trouble. But on the night of November 5th, 1975, that fearlessness would carry him somewhere no human being had ever been and return him forever changed. Travis worked alongside 6 other men under the supervision of Mike Rogers, who served as the crew boss. They were loggers, not the industrial kind with helicopters and mechanical harvesters, but the old-fashioned kind who work with chainsaws, axes, and sheer physical endurance. Mike Rogers had spent years assembling his crew carefully. The work demanded a particular kind of man, someone reliable, physically capable, and above all level-headed. Logging was dangerous enough without panic or poor judgment thrown into the mix. Mike knew his crew, trusted them, and had staked his professional reputation on their character. In early November, Mike secured a contract to clear-cut a 1,200-acre plot within the Sitgreaves National Forest in northeastern Arizona. It was an enormous undertaking, the kind of job that would push the crew to their limits. On the morning of November 5th, all 7 men piled into Mike's pickup truck and drove up into the forest as the sun climbed over the ponderosa pines. Mike briefed them plainly. The work was behind schedule, the deadlines were firm, and there would be no early stops. Everyone understood. Everyone got to work. By the time dusk settled over the forest, they had logged another brutal, bone-deep day. The temperature had dropped sharply. Their muscles ached with a particular exhaustion that comes from hours of manual labor in cold air, the kind of tiredness that sits in your joints, that makes your hands feel thick and slow. They gathered their tools, climbed into the truck, and began the long drive back down the access road toward civilization. The conversation was light, jokes about what they would eat, whether anyone had enough energy to shower before sleeping. Nobody was thinking about anything unusual. Nobody was looking for anything. And then somebody noticed a light. It appeared off the right side of the road, somewhere deep among the pines, a warm, golden glow pulsing steadily through the darkness. At first, nobody thought much of it. Lights appeared in forests for all sorts of reasons. Someone suggested it might be the moon, risen large and low on the horizon, but a crew member on the other side of the truck glanced out his window and shook his head. The moon was over there on the left. Whatever was glowing through those trees on the right was something else entirely. One of the men wondered aloud if it might be a forest fire. Mike Rogers slowed the truck and studied the light through the windshield. No smoke, he said. No smell of burning. No flickering quality that fire typically carries. The light was steady, almost mechanical in its consistency, and it was getting brighter the longer they looked at it. Travis, sitting toward the front of the cab, had been watching it since the first mention. Something about it tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. A pull that was neither fear nor excitement, exactly, but some charged combination of both that he had felt before moments just before something consequential happened. He suggested they drive over. There was a connecting road nearby, a short detour. They could get a closer look and then continue home. The others were reluctant, fidgeting in their seats, exchanging glances, but they agreed. What was the harm in taking a look? Mike turned onto the side road and drove slowly through the trees. The trunks pressed close on either side. The headlights swept across bark and shadow. Nobody spoke, and then the trees thinned. The road widened into a clearing, and Mike's foot lifted from the gas without any conscious decision. Every man in that truck fell silent, hovering 50 to 100 feet above the clearing, motionless, soundless, and perfectly stable, was an object unlike anything any of them had ever seen. It was disc-shaped, wide and symmetrical, with panels of soft, layered light arranged across its underbelly in a pattern that spoke of extraordinary engineering. It did not spin. It did not drift. It simply hung in the air with a calm, almost arrogant certainty that defied everything they understood about gravity and physics. One of the crew members, a man who built houses on weekends and understood structural load and engineering tolerances, would later describe his reaction not as terror, but as awe. He could see the craftsmanship in the object's design, the deliberate, precise construction of something built to last, to travel, to endure. It was, he would say, beautiful in a way that a cathedral is beautiful. It communicated intelligence and intention far beyond what the eye could immediately comprehend. And then Travis opened the truck door and got out.